Panel 1, Microprocessor at 50, Looking Back and Looking Forward. I am Lizzie John, professor at University of Texas at Austin. An amazing team of panelists are gathered here to reflect on the successes in the past 5 decades on microprocessors and also look forward to the next couple of decades. This is how Intel announced 4004 in November of 1971 in a full 2-page ad in the Electronics News Weekly. 2,300 transistors were integrated into 4004 chip, but we have come a long way from there with billions of transistors in current modern microprocessors. And to look at the successes from these 5 decades, this team of panelists are gathered here, and they are creators of designers of original processors, creators of new ISAs, founders of various microprocessor companies, an amazing team who have accomplished quite a lot. If I start describing each of their accomplishments, probably there will be no time left in this panel for them to speak. They are all very well decorated. So I'm going to give a short introduction on all of them, and so they get some time to speak and you get some time to listen to them. Federico Faggin, designer of the first commercial microprocessor, Intel 4004. He started his career in Italy and then moved to California in the 60s. He was at Fairchild, Intel. He founded Zilog, which made the Z80 microprocessors. He was CEO of Synaptics. He was awarded the National Medal of Technology and Innovation in 2009. He just recently published his autobiography, a book called Silicon, and he describes many of the interesting stories around the time the first microprocessor was designed. Welcome, Federico, to ISCA 21. We are so happy you are here. We congratulate you on your outstanding accomplishment, and thank you for participating in this panel. John Hennessy, co-founder of MIPS Technologies, pioneer of RISC, shared Turing Award with Patterson, chairman of Alphabet. He was the 10th president of Stanford, author of the popular architecture book, co-authored with Patterson. Patterson, he led the Berkeley RISC project, which became the basis for SunSpark, shared Turing Award with Hennessy for pioneering RISC. He is currently at Google. He is co-author of the popular computer architecture books. Glenn Henry, he is an IBM veteran. He designed computers spanning from IBM mainframes to personal computers. He left IBM and was senior VP at Dell. Then he founded his own x86 CPU company, Centaur. Currently, he is president of Centaur Technology. Kathy Papermaster, she is a semiconductor veteran for 26 years, designer at IBM. She led multiple IBM projects, including the Cell Broadband Engine microprocessor. She originally started in Vermont in 1983. She moved to Austin in 91 and was involved with design and integration of PowerPC 601, PowerPC 604, PowerPC 970. She was director of the Sony Toshiba IBM Center that designed the Cell processor used in the Sony PlayStation. Lee Smith, one of the founders of ARM. He is an ARM fellow. He joined Acorn in 1983. He led the development of software tools at Acorn and ARM. Right now, he is joining us from Cambridge, UK. Shekhar Borkar, currently at Qualcomm, but before that, he directed microprocessor research at Intel for 35 years. Former Intel fellow. When he started in 1981 in Intel, He worked on the Intel 8051 microcontrollers, and later on IVAR multi-computer and Intel supercomputers. After that, he has been doing research and influencing many of the processors that have come in the past 3 decades. Chris Rowan, co-founder of MIPS Technologies along with John Hennessy. Chris has the distinction of being the first PhD student of John Hennessy. Chris also founded companies Tensilica and Babel Labs. Tensilica was bought by Cadence. Babel Labs was bought by Cisco. Currently, he is VP of Engineering at Cisco. He's a big pioneer of the hardware-software co-design philosophies. Scott Gardner. He's an independent analyst specializing in microprocessors and AI. Currently, he is very active in the ML Commons and in the ML Perf benchmarks for machine learning. He was at IDT for 10 years. He was VP of Intrinsity, which was acquired by Apple. He was formerly a senior analyst at Microprocessor Report. And finally, I am here. Once I found Scott to moderate this panel, I didn't need to be here, but as ISCA program chair, I wanted to be personally here and welcome all of these distinguished panelists to this event. ISCA is very honored that you have joined us. Without further ado, I want to hand over to Scott to get the panel going. So a warm welcome to all of you panelists to ISCA 2021. Scott, audience, you should send in your questions. As Scott is moderating, I will monitor the questions. And as you send in your questions, I will ask them to the panelists.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lizzie, for the introduction. And greetings to our esteemed panelists. And I'd also like to send a shout out to all of the folks at ISCA. Since this is remote, we actually, I think, have a much larger crowd than a normal ISCA. And I know a lot of press have joined this panel because this is actually a really historic event, having this group of people together. So I just want to kind of warm things up a little bit and talk about some of the history, have some show and tell. But one of the things I want to make sure everybody understands is everybody watching, everybody on this panel owes their career to the microprocessor. We all have great stories about when we got our first computer. Mine was a TRS-80 in 1977 with a Z80. And so I think everybody, Lee was telling us stories. Everybody has been involved in microprocessors. So everybody watching this saw this panel and really wanted to see this interaction. So one of the things I want to point out is this is a human interest panel. We really want to see the panelists talking to each other, and Zoom's going to make it a challenge, but I really encourage the panelists to talk to each other. So this picture, I couldn't find the physical one. I took this picture a couple of years ago. This was the 25th anniversary of the microprocessor. So at Microprocessor Forum, which was the annual trek everybody went to announce new processors, they celebrated the 25th anniversary. And in the upper left-hand corner of this folio is a 4004. So this notebook, that chip in there is 50 years old today. So here we are at the 50th. And so we're going to celebrate that processor. One point I want to make that perhaps explains my bio before all of these guys get going is if you see the logo on my shirt, I was at IDT, and we actually have a chip there, the R5000. So we were one of the semiconductor companies actually building the chips for MIPS. And so my role was probably the most fun I've had in my career was as a field apps engineer. So my task was to go out and talk to system designers about what microprocessor to choose. And it wasn't just the MIPS companies, because IDT did fast logic and SRAM. So I actually had an opportunity to work with designers all over the world because I was eventually the worldwide FA manager. And so all of these chips are part of my life. So I would contend, and you guys can pick a different era, but I would say the 1990s represent the coolest decade of the last 50, because I think that's when the most competition was occurring, the most innovation. And so I'll be interested to hear, maybe Federico thinks it's the first decade, but that was definitely a really fun time in the 1990s. Lizzie, go to the next slide. And actually, what what I should do here. Let's do Federico's book first. So I encourage everybody to get Federico's book. I don't know if you guys can see as I get to the camera here, but Federico sent us a signed copy of this. I had actually got an early start reading it on Amazon, but this is his story of pretty much how he started back in Italy in World War I, born in World War I, and eventually made his way, as Lizzie said, to Fairchild and Intel, and invented silicon gate technology and actual full story about the 4004. The very first quote, so he fills us with quotes from philosophers. And so I grabbed this one, which I thought was just fascinating because this is exactly the title of our panel. So this fellow here is apparently a Danish existentialist philosopher. As it turns out, he's apparently the first existentialist philosopher. But yes, life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forward. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look backwards 50 years, and I'll be asking, once we do quick introductions, asking every one of the panelists to talk about some inflection point they saw in the last 50 years, and then what they see going forward. So the other show and tell item I have is pretty cool. So this is the Hennessy-Patterson textbook. And so I had to admit that since I'd left college, I had never read a textbook cover to cover. And so this is actually the industry panel for ISCA. But this textbook from academia became must read for anybody doing microprocessor design. And so went down, thumbing through it here. There's actually a quote here, and the panelists might want to revisit this. We couldn't read it on camera, but so this is actually from Stephen Shabilsky, one of the early MIPS folks doing memories. He says here, he says RISC, defined as any computer announced after 1985. So this edition of their book was done in 1990, and so we can now revisit that as the definition of RISC, because that was whatever that was 30 some years ago, I guess. So. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and I will just do a little bit of the agenda here. So as I mentioned, we're going to try to fit in this panel, and I'm going to try to speak as little as possible to make sure the panelists get as much airtime as possible. But we'll spend about the first hour looking back, and then we'll look forward. And I really want to try to get the panelists to talk to each other. But we're going to start with every single panelist. We'll do about a 2-minute introduction to give their long version of their bio, particularly as it relates to their involvement with the microprocessor. So we'll spin through everybody so that nobody has to wait very long before they get into the discussion. I might throw out like what is a microprocessor, and I challenge John Hennessy to just tell us real quickly, what would you have told your undergraduates was a microprocessor? What made the 4004 the microprocessor? And maybe even Dave Patterson will correct him or have a different opinion. So, but then I want to go through all of the panelists and say, okay, been 50 years, just pick those 1 or 2 inflection points that got us to where we are. And these may be negative inflection points. Maybe something went sideways and we'd all be having flying cars if we hadn't, gone this other direction. And then we'll try to get then to the future and predict what's an inflection point that's going to get us to the microprocessor 25 years from now, and then what will be a microprocessor 25 years from now. So there are no forward-looking statements. Some of these folks work for public companies. These are their personal opinions, but they're going to go on record and tell you when you come back here in 25 years, this is what the microprocessors become. And then, as we mentioned, Lizzie's going to be monitoring questions, and hopefully we have a little bit of time for that. So with that, let's can we get back to the order? I think the best thing is let's go ahead and start with Federico. Could you go ahead and tell your story in just a couple minutes, and then we'll just keep moving.
Very good. Thank you, Glenn. The story starts in 1968. At that time, I joined Fairchild Semiconductor. And in 1968, pretty much almost all the integrated circuits used bipolar technology. There was a up-and-coming technology called MOS, metal oxide semiconductor. They still had many problems. And I believe that was really the future, because you could put a lot more transistors in a single chip, but the technology was extremely slow and unreliable. So my first job was to actually create a new technology that remove all the limitations of metal gate MOS technology. That was 1968. And at the end of 1968, I had developed the technology, and the first commercial integrated circuit using it, the Fairchild 3708. And this technology used silicon instead of metal, polycrystalline silicon instead of aluminum, that made possible self-aligned gates, made possible transistors that were 5 times faster with the same design rules of a metal gate. And also we could put twice as many transistors in the same chip, because with another invention of mine, with the Berry contact, we could connect directly without metal, the gate with a junction. So with that technology now, finally, we had something that would allow us to put an entire CPU on a single chip. Why is it important to be in a single chip? Because in those days, the MOS technology had very poor driving characteristics. If you took a signal out of a chip and brought it back into another chip, like you would need if you had a multi-chip microprocessor, then you would lose so much speed that basically it would just not be that useful. Microprocessor can only be useful if they're fast enough so that you can create all kinds of different products with the same device. And so a single chip was necessary. And the chance to do that came at Intel. Intel had taken the technology that we had developed at Fairchild. And so Intel had the silicon gate technology. And they also had a customer that wanted a custom job. The customer was called Busicom, and Busicom had already developed a architecture that used 3 chips to make a CPU, but they were using read-write memory that were shift registers. So the shift registers are serial memories, which is the only memory that was available in those days. And clearly, you wanted a RAM memory for a computer. So Ted Off saw that opportunity because at that time Intel was developing dynamic RAM. Dynamic RAM were possible with silicon gate because silicon gate had about 100 to 1,000 times less leakage current, and a dynamic RAM requires very low leakage current to work. And so Ted Off with Shima, Masatoshi Shima, the engineer of Busicom, and Stan Mazer, they improved the architecture of Busicom, and they created a 4-chip architecture, of which the other 3 chips were a ROM, a RAM, and a I/O, so that we could build computers, different kinds of computers with those 4 chips. But the CPU was way beyond what anybody had ever designed before, so nobody knew how to design it at Intel. I was hired 6 months later after the project was sitting there, and my job was to figure out how to do it. And given my knowledge of the silicon gate technology, also I had designed and built a small computer when I was at Olivetti in 1961, and I knew how to do logic and circuit design. So I had all the pieces necessary to do what was needed. That chip worked in March of 1971. It was commercially sold at Busicom in that month. And then I pushed the Intel management to actually sell that chip. In those days were only was only for that customer, was exclusive to Busicom, to actually get out of the exclusivity contract and actually sell that chip to everybody. And that was the ad that you saw earlier of the introduction of the 4004, called MCS4 family, the 4 chips, in November of 1971. Quickly, I also led the design of the 8008, the first 8-bit microprocessor at Intel. And then I came up with the idea and led the development of the 8080, which was the first microprocessor of high performance, 6 times faster than the 8008. And that microprocessor really began to create the microprocessor market. I then decided that it was time for me to start my own company. I wanted to make a microprocessor company. Intel was a memory company that sold microprocessor to sell more memories. And so for me, that was not acceptable. And I thought the microprocessor were the future. And so I started Zilog. There I developed the Z80 with Shima. And that microprocessor was a very, very powerful device. In fact, I believe we were the first to use pipelining on the microprocessor, what defined RISC. We had pipelining in the 4-bit ALU with which we were doing 16-bit operations. But that was a CISC architecture, and that really started that plus the 8080 started the old and the 6502 started the microprocessor market, which was really the key, the first major event in the history of microprocessor, because that created a business that drove microprocessor for the following 50 years, or that, let's say, 40 years. I stop here, otherwise I take too much time.
Yeah, that was 6.5 minutes. So yeah, we're going to have to pick up our pace here. So just a couple minutes. Who's going to be able to get us back on time? John Hennessy, can you give it a shot?
I'm getting back on time. So I arrived at Stanford, and the first course I taught was a microprocessor lab course using 8080s, and then later on from Federico's Z80s, because I remember going down to Zilog and visiting them early on when they were just a startup company. But my background was really in compilers, and I was doing compiler research, and I realized that we could compile down to a much simpler instruction set and simply eliminate the need to do runtime interpretation through microcode. And that was kind of the way we came at the RISC ideas. And of course, we could see that Moore's law was going to allow us to do the other things that we thought real computers should do, virtual memory, caches, all those kinds of things. That was going to happen. What I think nobody really saw was that microprocessors were going to take over the entire computer industry, and they were going to do it by 1990, basically. And it happened so fast and so quickly, which is just a tribute to the incredible progress in semiconductor technology. Okay, Scott.
That's great. And so, Dave, I'm going to go to you because I know you may hate this, but I just lump you guys together. It's always, we talk about the Hennessy and Patterson. And so like it's this noun that you guys are joined together, and congratulations on your Turing Award. So go ahead and tell us your story about microprocessor.
I'm stuck with Hennessy. He's this anchor around my career. I just agree with everything that John says, but I actually did microprogramming tools. And basically what RISC is an instruction set that doesn't need microcode. And the prevailing wisdom before then, you need to have an interpreter inside your hardware that did the microcode. And that was basically the inside. And then we all believed in Moore's law, like John said. And so everything that was in a mainframe computer was going to necessarily be in a computer. And John and I just got working on it when you could do a 32-bit microprocessor. And the mini computer industry had just recently gone from 16-bit address computers to 32-bit. And we saw you could do a 32-bit address-based microprocessor that was feasible. And then the question is, well, does that make sense to do a microcoded interpreter in a 32-bit microprocessor? And the answer was no. And then I think the rest of it was pretty not so surprising. It was just, I think the thing that people don't realize, it was extraordinarily controversial. People thought we were spreading lies. That we were going to damage the computer industry by making simpler the prevailing philosophy that you build in microcode a very high level instruction set, and that would make software more reliable and software take less time. And what we were doing was going to set back the computer industry. So for at least a few years, there were a lot of people who thought we had dangerous ideas that and they tried to suppress it. And tag, I'll pass the baton on.
Well, let's just keep with the Stanford theme here, Chris. So tell us what you've had to do with microprocessors in the last 50 years.
Yes. So I came originally from a physics background, and of course, when I fresh out of school, I went to work for Intel, which was a memory company, in 1977, and gradually moved more and more towards microprocessors and then really applications. And in fact, looking back over the 50 years, the most important development, the most important milestones along the way is probably not the instruction set architecture battles. But I think there is the great split, the great divide, which really became obvious starting about 25 years ago. There is the mainstream, which is mostly about how we raise the level of abstraction, we raise the convenience, we raise the speed of development, and we have higher and higher level languages and libraries and operating systems and cloud-based services, which dominate computing today. And really, it's about how you make it really easy to deploy new applications. And how efficient it is really of second order. And then the other side of the divide is more domain specific. It's the really computationally intensive things led by graphics, AI, and real-time media processing. And they're very different in their computing demands. And that's where you really care a lot about how efficiently you use energy, how efficiently you use silicon real estate to accomplish a lot of application throughput. And so standard architectures are about high development efficiency. And domain-specific architectures are really about how you achieve computational efficiency. And the example that I would use to characterize it is in the old days and in domain-specific architectures, you legitimately ask questions like, what is the energy to do a 32-bit add? And you'd say, oh, okay, that's a few tens of femtojoules. Isn't that great? And in this chip, I can do thousands or hundreds of thousands per cycle. On the other hand, when you ask, well, what do people do for adding in the real world? The most dramatic example is the way you do adding in the real world in the modern application domain is you say, hey, Siri, what's 23 plus 46? And if you then ask, well, how many cycles did it take to do that add? The answer is probably billions of cycles spent doing one add compared to what you would have imagined on a GPU. And my career has really followed that, going from working in the silicon to working in RISC to really thinking in the mid to late 90s about domain-specific architectures and creating Tensilica, which explicitly said, instruction set architecture doesn't matter very much. And so over the course of the next 20 years, Tensilica brought to production through its licensees several thousand distinct instruction set supersets of the basic thing, and has delivered through its partners, I think, more than 40 billion microprocessor cores. So within that, one of those streams became very important. And in the other stream, which is the kind of the mainstream architectures dominated by x86 and ARM instruction set, really, really important. It's the biggest part of the industry, but it represents just one part of the great divide.
Okay, well, you said ISA doesn't matter. Let me go to Kathy, because IBM felt it necessary to do their own ISA, the PowerPC. You worked with some partners. So go ahead and tell your story.
Yeah. So I joined IBM in 1983 in Burlington. I, like some of the others, I love semiconductor physics. I joined as a circuit designer at an interesting time too, when most of the bipolar work was done in East Fishkill, and they were really the cash cow for IBM. But in Burlington, Vermont, they had just launched, they went from NMOS to CMOS and silicon gate technology. So I love Federico's book. I love going back to that. It brought back tons of memories, or of my memories. And anyway, so I was doing circuit design there, but it was for standard cell library development. But eventually we said, let's move south. It's too cold here. We came to Austin, and at the time, Austin, it was a, big, starting with the whole RISC processors for consumer, and Somerset was the name of the IBM, Motorola, Apple design center, where I started with doing the methodology work, laying the foundation. We had our own new tools. And then I was the 604 integration lead for that and its derivatives. So, focusing on all of the power, performance, design, cost considerations. From that launched into, that was the 90s. And again, I think, Scott, you mentioned too, I think the 90s was the best time, but I loved the team I was working on the whole bit. And then after that, after the whole Somerset and the PowerPC concluded, the PlayStation 3, the CellBE launched. And again, I loved it. I was in the early definition phase. We took trips to Japan, just talked with the whole Sony. Toshiba was involved. That transitioned to the design center. I did some other, work on the side, but then finally, when it launched into manufacturing, I was the director. And again, there's a theme here. I love doing these cost migration, again, faster, more cost effective, profitable, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's how I concluded my career, was with when the whole PlayStation 3, and I've been retired the last 10 years, but this has been a lot of fun listening to everybody here and bringing back all these memories. So thank you.
Yeah, glad you could join us. Well, Glenn, are you ready to tell your story, your short story? It's what have you been doing these years?
Yeah, well, as you can see, I've been doing this a long time. I started as an application programmer in 1963. I joined IBM in 1967. Was in the product division my whole 20 years, became an IBM fellow. And as the old guy here, I guess I'm the guy who's got to say there's nothing new under the sun. When I joined IBM in 7, roughly the same time that Federico joined Intel, IBM was shipping parts that had virtual memory, virtual machine emulation, caches, multiprocessing, out-of-order execution, a common API across very diverse implementations. And so it's the silicon technology, to me, that's the differentiator. Other than maybe branch prediction and a few other things, architecture has evolved naturally. It's the silicon that's allowed us to reduce the cost, the footprint, and the power along the way. Let me quickly finish, because there's one system I want to mention in the spirit of nothing's new. One of my projects that got me to be IBM fellow was a thing called the System 38. It had an object-oriented instruction set. It had high-level machine stuff. It had a single-level store, the 48-bit virtual address. This is in the 70s. Everything's in virtual address space. There's no files, etc. Had built-in relational database and the API, etc. So there's a lot of developments independent of the silicon technology.
So do you want to say anything about going to the dark side and building x86s and PCs?
One of the ways to look at things in this industry, to me, is look at long-term effects. And the long-term effects, since we're here to talk about the microprocessor, are twofold. It's the silicon gate technology and the innovations that Federico had that made it realistic. And silicon gate is what allowed the size, the power, et cetera, to be reduced. But the other implication of what Federico did was the 8080, which drove the microprocessor. And ultimately, there's a direct line between the 8080 and the parts that we do at Centaur and at Intel and at AMD that are the modern x86 architecture parts. Now, I think that's a wonderful thing. Not everyone in the industry agrees. So for Centaur, we've been doing x86 processors for 26 years, and some of our customers are IBM, Dell, HP, Lenovo, and Samsung. So we're a real company, and I'll thank John Hennessy, who, in a way we won't talk about, actually helped make that happen.
Okay, great. All right,
Also,
well, let's go ahead, Len.
thanks to
Glenn.
Federico, because he was on the board of IDT, and we got our
Yes.
initial funding from IDT. We're now owned by VIA Technologies.
Yeah, so a lot of us have this IDT heritage.
Yeah.
So let's go to ARM. So meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, this little company was doing low power processors, and you still are. You're the RISC processor that's still being very successful. That's incredible.
Well, kind of. I think RISC and CISC have converged hugely over the years. I'm not sure it's a very meaningful war any longer. I started my career when I was still at high school. I wrote my first program for an IBM 360 in Fortran. And this was probably the formative experience. I first came across microprocessors when I was an academic at Edinburgh University, and it was probably 1980 or 81. And we were looking to build a 3M machine, a MIP, a megabyte, and a megapixel. And we were surveying the microprocessors available and finding most of the chipsets of the era wanting in one way or another. Cut a long story short, we eventually built a machine based on the 68000. I ported the portable C compiler to it via VAX VMS. I won't go into why it was such a circuitous route, but it was necessary. And at the end of it, I was pretty impressed that this thing could hold its own compiling C code with the department's shared VAX 11780. That was kind of one up in my career for believing that microprocessors were going to become real. I moved to Acorn in 1983, and they proudly presented me with a BBC machine, which was their creation. And it had a 6502 inside, and I kind of couldn't take this thing seriously. And I guess my history is I did computer-aided design tools, and then I did compilers, and the reality is 16 bits is just not enough code space for any of those things. You can do overlays. I've used overlay managers. I've even implemented one. It's completely miserable. DOS extenders weren't much better. So, you know, for me, the real world of computing on integrated circuits began when we got 32-bit micros.
So I'll tell you what, Shekar, I put you last. You had another point, Lee?
Sorry, Scott, just to say that I was at Acorn when Acorn produced the ARM1.
Oh, okay. So how long were you between ARM and Acorn at pretty much the same place? You've 30-something years?
So, yeah, I was 7 years at Acorn, and then it's coming up 30. I can't do the arithmetic on camera.
Yeah, I just think that's astounding. So yeah, everybody this is one of the ARM founders talking to us now. It's incredible. What I was gonna, if you're done, Lee, I'm gonna, Shekar, what I'd like to do is start talking about inflection points. And you said you had a few slides, so I'll let you go ahead and do your bio and roll right into, okay, here's what I think, and looking back on the last 50, because you said you're going to be a little contentious, so I will let you go at it and give Shekar a little time to talk about his past. But then, if anybody on the panel would like to make a point about his contention, feel free to jump in. Let's get a conversation going.
Sounds good, Scott. Thank you. So my history is not as rich as everybody else's, but I'm a physicist. And I started my graduate school in the 70s and 80s, and I used 8-bit processors as well as 16-bit LSI 11 was the one that I used for my thesis. Then I joined Intel to work on the 8051 family of microcontrollers. And these microcontrollers, now you find them in your toothbrushes. Well, those days they were powerful machines. Then I switched on to high performance computing, followed by microprocessor research, and I'm a circuit researcher at heart. And I retired from Intel a few years ago, and now I'm with Qualcomm, and I'm working at the government division. So with that short introduction, let me show you what I want to share with you. So I'm going to first start with the panel questions. And the panel questions, I'm going to go through this very quickly. The first question that was asked was major challenges in the growth of the microprocessor. As I see them all the way from 80s to now, the major challenges really have been not technical, but unnecessary distractions, such as ISA wars. Chris mentioned ISA. ISA doesn't matter. I agree with you, but at the same time, Chris, ecosystem matters. So if the ecosystem doesn't matter, ISA doesn't matter. I completely agree with you. But some of us have to make a business. 50 years. Is it because of technology, architecture, compilers, or applications? And I think we are pretty much here in agreement. It's all of the above. The technologies provided transistors, but if you didn't have architectures to use and abuse them, you wouldn't know what to do with them. And finally, yes, software advances are necessary to make them user-friendly. So what's my advice to the young aspiring students? Just beware of fashion and hype. There is so much of that out there. Go do the research where your passion lies, and you'll be successful. So what are the technological challenges as it grows to 75 and the opportunities in the next 25 years? If you ask me, microprocessor is already mature. It's not going to grow anymore. So really, the opportunities lie in how to use them wisely in a system. So what will the microprocessor in the 2040 look like? Nothing much. It's already mature. It's just like a NAND gate. A NAND gate is matured. We don't redesign it every year. In the 70s and 80s, I designed them. I don't design them anymore. I just use them from the library. So a microprocessor will be a building block. It will look the same. And it's the whole system that matters even now and more so in the future. So don't get fixated by what the microprocessor will look like, but really more think about what the system will look like. That said, let me complete my talk here in the next 2 or 3 minutes by showing what I see as the inflection points. And these are measurable inflection points as I see them over the last 30, 40 years. So what I'm showing you on the x-axis here is what I call the inflection points as seen by the circuit designer from the architectures. And on the y-axis, I'm going to show you the die area of these inflection points, the performance, and the energy efficiency. So for example, the microprocessors before on-die caches and before they were pipeline, when they had caches and pipeline, you quadruple the amount of die area, you double the performance without changing the energy efficiency much. At that time, the frequency was the king, and the power was about 5 watts. Then came superscalar. This is like Pentium. So if you look at the Pentium, compared to this, you triple the die area. You approximately double the integer performance, but you had a loss in the energy efficiency. Then you went further to out of order and speculative execution. When you went there, if you look at the die area, it almost doubled. There was a performance increase, but the energy efficiency decreased. Frequency was still the king. This was the late 90s or the mid 90s. Single thread performance was still the king. That's what everybody wanted. The power was about 25 watts. So everybody said, you know what? Frequency is the king. Next inflection point. And this is, Scott, your point about a bad inflection point. Deep pipelines. Pipelines 28 deep. Well, yeah, the frequency increased. The die size doubled. Performance increased a little bit. Energy efficiency decreased even further. Now, this is all with respect to the previous generation. So you can think about architectural innovations being extremely inefficient in energy efficiency as you moved across the inflection points. Then we said, you know what, frequency was a king, but in the early 2000s, that was about the inflection point here. Go back to non-deep pipelines. Frequency doesn't matter. It's a multi-threaded performance and the multi-cores. I bring it back to 45-watt envelope. So if you ask me about what we have done, there have been several architecture and engineering innovations, but in reality, there is no significant architecture advance after the 70s, which is the IBM 370. Again, I'm not saying no architecture innovations, but nothing significant since then. So thank you.
Yeah, unmute here. Let me get some reactions here. Let's start with Dave Patterson. The bottom of our slide here says the 48th Annual International Symposium on Computer Architecture. Are we going to have to rename this conference? Do you agree with Shekar? Or are we kind of?
No, I don't agree with Shekar.
Okay, let's hear it.
John and I in our Turing Award said the inflection point going forward with now that Dennard scaling is over and Moore's law is ending, is domain-specific architectures, like Chris was talking about. Mm-hmm. So an example of an architect, and so what's happening, and this is what I think what Chris said, Chris Owen said, is the ideas that didn't make it for general purpose computing are being resuscitated in for domain-specific architectures. So I think, Norm Jupi gave the first talk today about Google's latest TPU, and he also gave the first talk at ISCA in 2017 about the first one, which I think will probably go down as a classic accelerator. But old ideas resuscitated, in particular systolic arrays. So that was that kind of interesting idea. Did it really find a place? I don't know. But because of machine learning right now is matrix multiply is at the heart of it. That was the perfect match, basically a two-dimensional computer architecture. The systolic array, and tying that to a systolic array is a very powerful set of ideas. And more or less, every time you use one of the vertical services, you're using machine learning, and most of them are running on a dedicated accelerator that is a big matrix multiply unit that's using systolic arrays to great effect.
So Dave, I didn't get that question out to you guys about what is a microprocessor. So would a systolic array qualify?
It's not that. No. I said it's a. I think it has. I think what's a processor? It fetches instructions and executes instructions. And I think a microprocessor, where the name came from, is just a processor is inside one chip. I think that's what a microprocessor is, and that's a lot easier to do with Moore's law when there's billions of transistors than it was when there's thousands of transistors.
So these big arrays of matrix multipliers, is there enough there to say, well, this is a microprocessor, or is this really just a compute unit?
Whether the TPUs are often, GPUs are accelerators, they're plugging into servers is the way they're normally done. But they do fetch their own instructions. They do make branches and conditions and stuff like that. They don't typically have virtual memory accelerators, but that's a direction that things could go. But there seems to be, this is also the MIT paper, there's plenty of room at the top, is where the semiconductor is no longer lifting all boats. There's going to be opportunities for computer architects and software people to collaborate together to make big gains in important areas. And if you don't do that, things aren't going to get any faster. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for architecture innovation in the domain-specific architecture place, because you don't have to run, you're not stuck with, a million-line C++ program and trying to figure out how the hell to make that go faster. These things are written in higher level languages. It makes it much easier to innovate below them. And, the application world is transforming, at least pieces of it are transforming away from the way they used to build programs through learning from data and machine learning. This is a force of nature. I think this will go down. The big things in my career was, I guess, the microprocessor, the internet, the World Wide Web. Machine learning may prove to be something that's significant. And that's a revolution that's going through the whole software stack. And the opportunities for architects below, there's plenty of opportunities for architects below that, plenty of room at the top.
Dave, that's great. It's a cool topic. Let me keep things rolling. You wanted to make a quick point, Shakar?
Yeah, the quick point I wanted to make is, Dave, you are agreeing with me when I made the statement that the microprocessor by itself doesn't matter. It's a system that matters. And that's exactly what you described. Thank you.
I don't, the microprocessor matters. I think the microprocessor matters. You can't have a system without a microprocessor.
I got a few more people I want to bring in here. John's been nodding a lot, so let me get him to make a comment here real quick.
So I agree with Dave. I think what Shekar's point misses is if the software model changes, the hardware model's got to change, because the instruction set is the interface between the hardware and the software. And if you think about what happened, those early microprocessors, we programmed them. We programmed them in assembly language. You couldn't use anything else. There wasn't enough memory in the machine. You had to squeeze every bit out. And then, of course, the RISC inspiration came from a high-level language viewpoint and the emergence of Unix. And this new thing, you've got to have CUDA to program GPUs, things like TensorFlow to program these other machines. And if the software model continues to change, then we ought to be willing to think about how the hardware model can change accordingly.
So let's keep rolling here. These were the two professors that teach computer architecture. I think Lee and then Chris, you both had some comments. Start with Lee.
Yeah, I felt that we ought to be making a distinction between the control plane and the data plane. It seems to me that in the control plane, Shekar is absolutely right. There's nothing new. There's nowhere to go. And, it's done. And everything you're talking about otherwise is doing more than just that general purpose control plane compute. It's all involved in shoveling huge quantities of data.
And there's probably a control plane processor as the host. Looks just like every other one for the last 30 some years. So
almost certainly, I would argue.
Glenn is agitating as well. You want to jump in real quick, Glenn? I promise Chris, but go ahead.
Well, I think the discussion of what's a microprocessor is silly. All we have are processors these days. The best microprocessor around, in my opinion, is in the IBM Z15, what you'd call a mainframe, but it's one chip, and it's really, really powerful. I didn't mention something, so I'll put in my special thing here. I'm a part-time professor at the Naval Postgraduate School doing research in processor security. And I think the fallacy of all of it, first of all, we sit around talking about the big challenge is how we're going to use all the silicon, right? The next generation has 2 to 4x the transistors in it, and we all invent things like our latest processor has an AI coprocessor in it, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is all going to change because the risk of security in our current processor designs are very, very high. And I believe, my opinion, that the proper approach to providing bulletproof security is going to change some of the things that we've been doing in processor architecture. And if we don't do something and just keep doubling the transistors every 2 years, I think it's going to be a real problem.
Yep, just keep turning off those features you keep adding. Chris, go ahead and make a comment, but then also go ahead and give us your inflection point. So let's keep it rolling.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to work backwards from the application developers. And a modern application developer does not think very much about instruction set architecture. They don't even think about the OS interface or the compiler very much. They're very often working at the level of some Python or JavaScript level. They're invoking libraries, they're invoking cloud services, and how they stitch those together is centrally important to what is the distribution of work that needs to be done. A lot of those are very generic. There are trillions of lines of code out there. The average line of code doesn't get executed very much. And so we get to this very unequal distribution. Some lines of code matter a lot because they are very heavily used. And in those cases, architecture matters a lot. And we're going to work our way to figure out how we drive the silicon from the lines of code that matter. But in terms of the overall impact of the IT universe, that's very much more driven by how productive the environment is. How can we create new services which, while they may not really execute a lot, still matter a lot to the environments in which we live? And so this leads us inevitably, I think, to hybrid architectures, where we're going to try to put together the best of both worlds, such that the average line of code is compiled and runs almost transparently, and you don't really matter, doesn't matter very much what it runs on, so long as it gets done. It's very much more about ecosystem than it is about instruction set architecture.
So do you think
On
we'll
the
have
other
fully
hand-
heterogeneous systems and heterogeneous operating systems? And sure.
And you're going to have to paper over the fact that it's heterogeneous so that nobody really notices.
Yeah.
Some parts of it are going to matter a lot, and where you're really going to push the envelope on efficiency. Given that standard scaling and Moore's law are not going to give us those increases in efficiency, it's in
So
domain.
Chris, I want to get back to Federico real quick. Go ahead. Do you have an inflection point you want to leave us with? But looking back the last 50 years, what would you pick? Do you know what inflection point you would have?
Go on mute, Federico.
Well, I was thinking Chris
Yeah,
might say so.
sorry.
Let's go ahead and
Yeah.
go to Federico.
Yeah, so to me, the important inflection points are the ones that move all the aspects of technology in a certain direction. And so for me, the first major inflection point was personal computer, and especially when IBM decided to enter the business and have a PC that was open, an open system, and which created an incredible frenzy of applications, ideas, and so on, and drove the market for 40 years. And then the next one was the iPhone. The iPhone was a PC plus internet, and all this stuff that we learned in the meantime. So that is now driving the technology directions in which the applications are moving and so on. And now we see, of course, machine intelligence and AI and so on, robotics, that require their own specialized architecture, specialized hardware. And the technology that could be essential to this are really the FPGAs, for example, where you can fill programmable gate arrays that will allow to configure the hardware for a particular application, so that you gain in flexibility, which is a fundamental, as I see in the future. Someone mentioned security. I think that is fundamental also. I think that the cybercrime and all these problems that we see will get only worse. And so we really need to think through, what do we need to create computers that are not hackable? And that to me is foundational. I stop here.
Kathy, what do you think? What would you? Let's just do the inflection point. What happened in 50 years? What really?
Actually, I'd have to add. I'm sort of surprised. I think I definitely agree with Federico. But as an inflection point, technology kind of driving the whole thing. And I guess you said it before earlier, but to me, just seeing CMOS in general, and I guess that's just basic foundation there. And no one really mentioned the role of design automation along the way and what that allowed us to do, right? So I don't know if you call that an inflection, but again, it was something over the years, technology was driving. And I'll just add those 2 points because I don't have much more to say beyond what everybody else has already.
Dave, let's go to you. You go on the record. What really changed in the last 50 years that got us to where we are?
I was going to try and move on. Looking at the clock, I was going to try and move on to the predictions. Is that okay?
Let's do that. So,
Okay, I actually prepared a slide. So.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, yes. Go ahead.
Since I prepared it, let me go ahead and show it.
All right. So we're looking 25 years forward. There we go.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say was, I think you can still see my screen. Maybe I should have done that in different order. So. In 1995, they had the 150th anniversary of Scientific American. So they asked me to predict microprocessors 25 years into the future. So
last year. Okay.
yes, and so I was able to read what I said. And so what I said was, and when I looked at a bunch of predictions from the past of the future, they were very exotic. You know, computers would be made of biological material. We did have optical computing. The stored program computer is this old-fashioned idea to go away. And so I said 25 years ago, is my radical prediction is that the computers of 2020 will be very familiar with to the people of the computers of today. And then, you know, speculated that we'd have, you know, more processors per chip, and, you know, the chips would get really big, and we'd also have really tiny ones, and those things had to be true. But the Scientific American people thought that was such a boring prediction that they had an insert where they said, what about you know, single element electrons or biological computers and reversible logic? If you remember reversible logic.
Yes,
so
yes.
They put a sidebar in that was more, and so I think when people predict the future, they try to do something entertaining. But I think when I've tried to predict the future, you try to predict this has to happen. I can't imagine this not happening, and you got a better chance. So my bullets are, if we agree that the instruction set is not life and death, but we need one, there's going to be the control plan, and then why use proprietary instruction sets? So I just think the open instruction set architecture, which RISC-V is leading one, must become more popular. Linux was controversial 25 years ago. Companies said you can't trust software, and open source is buggy, all stuff. And Linux is the standard today. So I think RISC-V will be as standard as Linux is today. People like open source stuff. This one's good enough, and lots of people innovate. And like other people have already brought up, we've got to try and improve security. And I've given up on my software colleagues figuring out a way to make bug-free code that's instantly patched, right? That's not going to happen. So I think, and I don't think as a society, ransomware is going to be the IT tax, and we're going to be happy with that. I mean, even the president of the United States is aware of ransomware, right? He's had to. I think it's up to hardware people, computer architects, to attack this. There are people doing really interesting work now. You know, seeing the first bullet, RISC-V is an open architecture. You don't have to work for one of these companies to get it. Have industrial strength ideas and get a whole software stack to be able to do it. Quantum computing that we haven't talked about, you know, it's there's a lot of excitement about it, but it's a cloud thing. It's not an edge thing. So the edge is still going to be important. I don't know if CMOS is going beyond 2 nanometers, but we've got to have something there. And so my prediction from 2020 for 2045 is the same as it was more or less in 1995, is that the stored program concept is too elegant. It's going to look like machines of the past. It's, you know, at least the edge is going to look like Siemens fans. So I think if we're around in 2045, it's not going to be startling. So that's my speech.
Maybe I bring in Federico based on a point you made. We had a chance to geek out for an hour and a half or so the other night. And he said we're probably looking at a gap after about 3 nanometers. That, you know, it's going to have to be something clever. Something's got to happen. You know, it's pretty clear once you get transistors the size of the silicon atom that, you know, you've reached a point at which something major has to happen, and it might be.
But not only does it have to happen, it has to beat CMOS at 3 nanometer in terms of manufacturability and cost. So we could plateau for a while. You know, I always marveled that we got to design chips where the technology was moving faster than any engine in the world. We could end up stuck in, like other engineers in other fields, and have to build it out of the same material every year and still innovate.
Which you'd argue that architecture matters. Go ahead.
Well,
go ahead, Federico.
Yeah, that's what I think as well. I think that we are about to plateau. I don't see much hope below 2 nanometers. You know, with current technology, being able to do the many things that we do with silicon, we don't do just one thing. So then what can we get? You know, where can we get a technology that can work at room temperature and that can do better than silicon? I think, despite the fact that this is, you know, more science fiction today than real, that biology is the answer, but that biology, the answer will come probably 30, 40 years from now. The beginning of the answer will come 30, 40 years from now. I don't think that we will have something viable that could compete with silicon anytime sooner than that.
So Shakar, you got something controversial for the next 25-year microprocessor?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm sort of in agreement with this panel, but I'm sure that they will decide to disagree with me, so that's okay. So the point is here really, I agree with Federico. The technology, at least there is nothing in sight for me to replace CMOS in the next 15 years. Because if it's in sight today, it will happen in 15 years. It's nothing in sight. So with that said, we are engineers. We are not going to give up. We've got to keep the quote unquote Moore's law alive, at least in some shape or form. And it's about time now that despite the lack of technological advances, now we're going to get really wise. In the past, we used architectural advances to use the transistors that were freely made available. Now is the time to think backwards and see what are the architectural advances that I can use in the future, especially given that the technology is not improving. So some of the things that Chris mentioned, I agree with them, which is the things like domain specific. Yeah, I mean, to me, when you look at the domain specific solutions being integrated in a system means a lot of things to a lot of people. To me, an SoC is a system in which you have domain specific application processor sitting on. So it's that kind of a system level thinking that we need to do and not get fixated by a monolithic microprocessor. So I stopped there.
John Hennessy, you're going to be back in 25 years. You're going on the record. There are press here, and they're going to write this down. Professor John Hennessy said the microprocessor.
Yeah. So I think we're going to find that machine learning is even more useful than we thought. Just lots of applications are going to get moved to that space. We're going to use massive amounts of computing resources to do training and massive amounts of data to train those machines. And we're going to write less code. And you just have to look at Google's natural language system, right? It's a 1/100th the number of code lines. And it's more accurate than the previous system that was based on phrase-based analysis. So I think that's going to happen. I'm afraid that I agree with Federico. There may be an extended period here where we don't have a new technology and we're just going to have to innovate without the approach we're so used to from Moore's law. And think of what happened when we had tubes before the invention of the transistor. There was a long, steady period. Tubes did not get better much faster.
Yeah, right.
And we had a lot of issues with reliability and other things. We could have a similar kind of situation at the tail end of Moore's law.
That's cool. So Lee, what do you think? 25 years from now, you'll still be at ARM?
No, absolutely. I have plans, and they don't involve being in our 25 years. I think the panel has kind of come full circle, but it's answered its own question earlier. The way we prolong Moore's law is by exploiting more special purpose hardware. That just seems blindingly obvious. And the proof point's in your pocket.
Mm-hmm.
The baseband processor in your mobile phone contains a shed load of special purpose hardware for every radio modem your phone can do, and for the camera, and for video encoding, and probably video decode too. Arguably, the GPU that drives that giant screen is nothing but a special purpose piece of hardware. And that's all there to get energy and power efficiency.
So we're going to go Chris, Kathy, and then Glenn, and then I'll turn it to Lizzie in case there's
I want to make one more point.
Okay.
Which is all of those functions that go on in a base station, they're all done by software on more general purpose machines.
Even in the baseband?
All that radio baseband stuff is done by software-defined radio.
That's amazing.
The reason it's that way is it allows the deployment of radio standards to be incremental
Yeah.
and upgradable. And those base stations have to last not 2 years in your pocket, but 25 years in the street. So,
No, but yeah, I know the panel's not me, but that used to be science fiction. The idea that you could do software-defined radio and program the baseband to talk to any of these standards. So Chris, go ahead. What will it look like?
Well, I think that it's true that Moore's law has decelerated such that we're not going to get the energy per operation or the clock frequency increases that we got used to for a while. We still have actually a lot of headroom with respect to parallelism. And that means that any application which admits to parallelism is going to continue to thrive, particularly in the hands of computer architectures. Machine learning is exciting in part because it leaves room for an enormous amount of parallelism. And we'll see that at a higher level as well in parallelism between subsystems, some of which will be the general purpose programming glue, and some of which will be the nodes that exploit specific domain problems. But we will see continued progress in performance overall, and we'll see progress in productivity in these high abstraction, but it will be built on this heterogeneous mix of general purpose and domain-specific architectures that will be extrapolatable pretty easily from what we see today. So I'm an incrementalist as well.
Okay.
25 years from now is not going to look so different, except that the number and variety of domain-specific subsystems will be much larger, and the general purpose architectures will have unbelievably long lifetime because of the ecosystem for that glue.
So Kathy, you're going to come out of retirement and do a DNA computer?
No, but the technology node discussion is fascinating. It made me think of some other things, because if we really think the technology has that will be stuck, so to speak, then TSMC obviously has some lead on Intel and other fabs. Does that mean that they can catch up? I don't think TSMC would let that happen, but then at the same time, then you have to think about like AMD processors, Intel, NVIDIA, what are they going to do? How do they differentiate themselves in addition to, the technology and some of the leads you can get through that? So that by itself is an interesting discussion. So I'm not quite sure it's going to be completely stuck, but I guess we'll wait and see. And other than that, I mean, I guess, I'd like to just say it's exciting to see more and more, heterogeneous compute, leveraging vector computation, is pioneered by Cell. Cell was difficult to program at the time. Hopefully we, come and continue to evolve with that along the way. But, the burden on software to utilize these accelerators, hopefully they're lower those burdens, and maybe we'll see advantages that way as we look to the future. Anyway.
Excellent. Well, Glenn, I'm anointing you a visionary, and then we'll let Lizzie see if there's any questions that came across on the Q&A channel, and then I will be done.
Well, I don't think there's any great need for more technology. The things that we talked about, the AI, cryptography, compression, what have you, they're all very regular. And you can do a lot with the technology we have. As you can see, pouring more transistors into the general purpose processor is bad, in my opinion. That's where the security leaks of today, which by security leaks, I'm including, of course, bugs, right? The security leaks of today come from. I used to give a talk, I did it for 7 years in microprocessor form, on the evilness of out of order execution. Yeah. Of course, that was before we did it, but still, the benefit you get, the cost, performance, power benefits are all wrong. And we're doing that today. We sit around saying, well, let's see, in our next part, we could use 1 billion transistors per core. Let's, how will we do that? What funny things will we do? Oh, we'll have a 40-stage pipeline, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, right.
The wrong direction, and the general purpose processor part of the world doesn't need more technology. The performance limit today, as we all know anyway, is memory access.
Right. Latency. Yeah.
That's where, if we need silicon, that's where we need to use it. Yeah.
So Lizzie, do you want to chime in here? You've been getting people been just pouring
yes,
questions
yes.
in the channel.
There are many questions in the channel, so I will ask the first one. The first DRAM 1103 was introduced a few months before microprocessor 4004 by Intel. DRAM has since sticked around for the past 50 years without much changes. What do panelists think of emerging non-volatile memories, and how would these emerging NVM impact microprocessors in the next 25 years? Who wants to take that question first?
I can give it a shot.
Lee, go ahead.
Dave was
Whoever,
saying
just
something.
raise hands and just go ahead. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Me? Okay, sorry. I was just saying it's really hard for a new memory technology to win. In my career, there was all kinds of them. Bubble memories at IBM, all kinds of things. You have to find a niche and win in terms of cost performance and be able to grow the volume. So flash memory made it. You know, well, original semiconductor replaced core. Flash is a viable one, but for the new non-volatile memory technologies, many of them are promising, but there has to be a way for them to get to their volumes and get cost effectiveness. So it's a commodity kind of industry. It's a really hard thing to do. So I'd be great if one of them makes it, but I don't know which one will or why.
Chris.
And they've almost always used some difference in process technology. So they really only work pretty far out in the memory hierarchy, which means their interactions with the microprocessor design is sort of second order. So they're important at the system level, but not so much in direct influence in what you put on that chip.
But, you know, sometimes people say, or because the capacity is so high, we could rethink about the memory hierarchy entirely. And maybe, you know, although slow, the large capacity allows you to design different kinds of memory hierarchies. Does anyone have an opinion about that?
Well, I think one of the problems we're going to have is that SRAMs are starting to slow down compared to logic in the last 5 or 10 years. It was one of the first talks in Norm Jupe's recorded version of his talk. And that's gonna mean we get a bigger gap now, despite the fact that we keep growing caches. We're gonna see that the memory wall become increasingly a problem as we go along.
Shekhar, you seem to have an opinion.
Yeah, there are 3 rules in memories, external memories, not integrated memories. Number 1 is $1 per bit. Number 2 is $1 per bit. And number 3 is $1 per bit. So if we can beat these 3 rules, the only 2 technologies I see for the next 10 years are DRAM and flash. We can spend 2 hours discussing these, but that's my bottom line.
And they also be software issues with non-volatile memory to create the volume you need for that technology to break through. You need portable, attractive software level models of how persistence works. And that's still a research topic. And that suggests to me that it's at least 7 to 10 years away from being a deployed technology. And it's got to be pretty much right first time to generate the volumes that will displace or attack flash and DRAM. So yeah, one can hope, and certainly in niches, and some of the niches might be big, but
thank you. So another question.
I think it's difficult to beat 1 transistor per bit.
Yeah, I think Federico. Yeah.
In other words, you cannot have half a transistor per bit. That's a problem. And we're already there with the 2 type of memories that they are dominant in the market. So I see absolutely no way to go beyond that. There was a time where Spintronic was hopeful that it would create a memory that had all the characteristics of the sum of the 2, but they couldn't even come close. So.
Okay, there are lots of questions, so I think I'll move on to the next one. Do you feel that various fabrication companies are rushing through silicon technology nodes without extracting most out of a node before advancing to the next node? Who wants to take that?
That's what Intel's doing right now. It's slowing down the technology development so we can make the most of it before it moves to the next process.
Shagar.
Yes, you have to be careful when you look at the nodes and their numbers. Don't go by the numbers. Go and look at some of the characteristics of the process technology, such as what is a contacted gate pitch. And then you will see the difference between 10 nanometer of Intel's versus 7 nanometers of TSMC. Go take a look. And then you will find out, yes, the technology has slowed down, but not as it's hyped by the media.
Okay, I will move to another question. Why are we not investing more in 3D, in particular in monolithic 3D? Or should we invest more in monolithic 3D? Is that the way to go?
You want me to go, Lizzie?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So if you look at the monolithic 3D, its value proposition in logic is very slim for two reasons. One is extracting the heat out of stacked transistors because your power density, you're already limited by the power density and you're going to exasperate it. So and second is designing with the 3D integration of logic is so cumbersome despite the fantastic design tools we got. So the niche where it really works is stacking regular structures like DRAMs. So the DRAM stacking has been successful, but not so in the logic for the reasons I just mentioned.
Yeah, flash too, right? But that's it. Yeah, the power is one of the big challenges.
Okay, another question here. Commercial planes are limited to 950 kilometers per hour. Speed limit for cars exists in almost every country. Why can't we accept an upper bound on VLSI integration?
Simply
well, it's not. It's just like something we get to vote on. I vote for more transistors. I don't know if that's going to work.
Yeah, but my answer is very simple because we are engineers. We don't give up. Right? So if you give up, then just play dead and we are done. Okay, I mean that's a cop out.
Besides, who wants to limit the creativity of the next generation of application creators? Right? We want them to think big.
Yeah, and we've been talking about single chips, but obviously there's opportunity for revolution in packaging, right? There was a tremendous. It was so much simpler to just use a bigger chip every time, rather than bet on some radical packaging technology. That could be what the future looks like: is chiplets and something that looks more like, for those of us remember TTL. Simply, that could be what the future looks like. And if there's a very efficient packaging technology solution out there, that could be a game changer.
I hate to sound like a broken record. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I hate to sound like a broken record. The issue is that we're measuring things wrong. Benchmark performance is not the critical issue. Security is, and if benchmark performance was a critical issue, it's not coming from the processor. So I think we need to use more transistors. We need to use them more intelligently. We all know how to make a more reliable processor. We're just afraid to do it, but we could do it, and we could have thousands of them, for example, where today we have 100.
There are many more questions in the Q&A channel, but good times end very quickly. This panel is about time to finish for us. And so what I'm going to do is I will take the questions from the audience and offline send it through the panelists, and there is a way for the platform to get some answers back to those who asked. But time is up, so we need to get moving. I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking time from your day and joining this panel. Thank you so much. It was a very lively discussion. Thank you so much. Now, I'm also sure many in this audience have stories that your own experience with microprocessors. So it is just, by whatsoever the chance, in this year, the 50th year of the microprocessor's birth, I have another job also, editor-in-chief of IEEE Micro. So IEEE Micro is going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the microprocessor in its November issue. And anybody who has a good microprocessor story, pictures, anecdotes, send them to microp50@gmail.com. And selected stories will be printed in the Micro magazine or displayed on the IEEE Micro website. So I would like to thank all of the panelists again. And to the audience, we were talking about biological computing and quantum computing earlier during the panel. There are a few more panels coming every day, one in the evening, US time, one around this time every day. There is one on biological computing, there is one on quantum computing, and there are 6 panels altogether. Please attend some of them. And once more,
and my thank you as well to everybody. And don't forget to order off Amazon, get Federico's book. It's actually very, very good. Take care, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was great having you all for this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Scott.